Okay, hi, welcome to the next video. Back on the bike at Camp Fiver, and this next video is produced here for the chapter on depressants. Now let's get right into it. Depressants, you should recall, are not drugs that make you psychologically depressed. They are simply drugs that slow your nervous system. They depress the activity in your nervous system. So that's how we should always think of this classification of drugs. They are not the opposite of antidepressants. Antidepressants do have to do with psychological depression, and they work on other neurotransmission systems to try to quell those feelings of depression. But depressants, as we're talking about them in this chapter, again, physiologically or physically slow the nervous system. Okay, so what are some of the classical depressants? We basically have, I think, 3 or 4 categories of depressants or types of drugs that fit those categories. They are barbiturates, benzodiazepines, alcohol, and inhalants. So we'll cover each one of those 4 categories of depressants. Actually, we'll cover alcohol next week, and all dedicated to its own chapter because of its profound significance in our society. So today I just want to look at barbiturates and benzodiazepines quickly, and inhalants also right at the end. Going back actually before those classes of drugs emerged back in the 1800s, there have been drugs that were used to slow the nervous system, but do not belong to the same categories that I just mentioned. Some of those drugs include chloral hydrate. Chloral hydrate is the drug sometimes called knockout drops, often coming in a liquid form. They can easily be added to a drink in order to knock somebody out, make them lose consciousness, generally slow their nervous system. There's a classic reference to this in popular culture. This is the drug that was used in a drink called a Mickey Finn. A Mickey Finn is a drink with any kind of depressant added to it, but particularly chloral hydrate back in the day, when a bartender named Mickey Finn actually used them in order to quell customers into states of slowed alertness, we'll say. There's another, again, that's chloral hydrate. There's another drug called paraldehyde, which is very useful as a central nervous system depressant, but is not used generally because of its terrible taste. And it was very easy to detect by its taste and odor. It's quite noxious. And then there are bromides. Bromides is a whole classification of substances that will quell the nervous system, slow it, and they're widely used as sleep agents before the 1900s and before the time at which the barbiturates emerged, and that was around the early 1900s. So there's 2 categories of drugs that I mentioned, barbiturates and benzodiazepines. No, both start with B. You can shorten those to remember them better just as Barbies and benzos. Barbies and benzos are what we're talking about here, and you could think of barbiturates, as being the drug that was classically used in the early 20th century, and benzodiazepines is the drug that is typically used now, from the 1960s to the present. And what are these drugs used for? That's a good question. Generally, there's 2 uses for either of these classes of drugs, and both have to do with slowing the nervous system, but there are different reasons why one might want to slow the nervous system. You might want to slow the nervous system because you're anxious. These are drugs that are designed to sedate you, to make you calmer, to lead to less anxiety, and these drugs can certainly do that. Another reason to slow the nervous system is to go to sleep. People who have sleep difficulties, insomnia or other problems sleeping, classically turn to these drugs for sleep aids. So the first use of these drugs we call sedative use, and the second use for sleep is called hypnotics, sort of producing a hypnotic-like state in the mind of the user so that they can go to sleep. And so together, depressants are often called clinically sedative-hypnotics. Okay, so let's look at the classic sedative hypnotics in the first part of the 20th century, and that would be barbiturates. They come from a substance called barbitol. Barbitol was discovered in the early 1900s, look at my date here, 03, and barbitol, going by the brand name of Veronal, became the first sedative hypnotic to be used clinically, or to be prescribed to people with anxiety or sleep conditions. They are formulated and grouped based on two different qualities of these drugs, and that is, how long do they take to affect you, and how long will they last? So the three types of barbiturates or barbitols that either take effect quickly and don't last long, or take some time to affect you and last quite a bit longer, are secobarbitol, amobarbitol, and phenobarbital. These are the classic barbiturates. So each one of these has a different time to onset and duration. That's what we call how long they last and how much they affect you. You can read about the specifics for time to onset and duration in the notes about those three varieties of barbiturates. But generally, one, whoop, gonna hit that tree. There we go. Generally, one drug will be the one with short time to onset and short duration, is more likely to be used as an anti-anxiety pill when somebody gets really ramped up and they need a kind of instant relief from that. They'll take the shorter lasting, quicker acting barbiturate. And if they're looking for a sleep effect, a hypnotic, then they'll more likely want it to last longer through the night. And it doesn't really matter if it starts to affect you right away or within the next 45 minutes to an hour. Eventually you'll be affected and you'll go to sleep. So those are the barbitols. There are some related groups of drugs and specific drugs, such as thiopentol. Thiopentol is a barbiturate which has profound action on the nervous system, sedating somebody to the point, sedating somebody to the point where they can say things that are maybe on their mind, but they wouldn't necessarily tell a stranger. This is a drug that has classically been called truth serum. You might have seen that in movies or in popular media. Somebody's given a truth serum, and it's not exactly as the fiction depicts sometimes, where they can't help but tell the truth, like they're captured by Wonder Woman's lasso or something. But they are somewhat effective and have been used by government agencies such as the CIA to interrogate people and try to get them to reveal secrets that otherwise they would not reveal, because they're so relaxed and open. I'm sure there are more sophisticated substances today that agencies such as that use, but this was an early truth serum, thiopental. Incidentally, it's also the first drug given in the cocktail of drugs for those who are undergoing the death penalty. All right, let me get off here and see where I'm going. I gotta climb this hill. All right, clean my camera off. There we go. All right. So those drugs were commonly used in the early part of the 20th century, between 1900s and 1950. In the 1960s, a new classification of drugs emerged. Somewhere between there was a drug that was hesitantly used, but eventually became illegal, and that was called methaqualone. Methaqualone is more popularly known as Quaaludes. Quaaludes that's the brand name, sometimes shortened in common talk to just ludes. Quaaludes were profoundly acting sedative, and although they did not show high potential for dependency in clinical tests and was labeled as such when it was released in the 1960s, further investigation showed that these are drugs that do, in fact, have a high potential for dependence and abuse. In 1973, Quaaludes were put on the Controlled Substances Schedule 3, indicating that there was some medical use, but by 1985 it was determined that better drugs had appeared and that it was no longer necessary for medical use because of the danger of dependence and, to some extent, the lethality. These are drugs that, when taken in quantity, can be very dangerous and could kill you by just slowing your nervous system too much. So in the 1960s, the benzodiazepines, benzos as I call them, the benzos appear on the market, and the first benzodiazepine to be produced is Librium. And the advantage that Librium and the other benzodiazepines have for sedative and hypnotic use are that they treat anxiety without the dangers of lethality that came with barbiturates, and also without the potential for dependence. While the potential is there, as you'll see in the online media for this week, it is far less than the dependence potential for barbiturates. So these were considered a better, newer alternative to the barbiturates, the benzodiazepines like Librium. 4 benzodiazepines have been in the top 100 drugs of all time in terms of prescription medicine, and those are Valium, popular in the 1970s, Xanax, popular today, that is a benzodiazepine, Xanax, Ativan, another one popular today, and an anxiety drug known as Klonopin. So the mechanism of action of the benzodiazepines, it's now understood, is that they are working on the same inhibitory neural network system that alcohol affects, and that is the GABA neurotransmitters in the brain. The GABA neurotransmitters are those that slow neural activity, inhibit action potential, and the electrical signals that trigger activity in the central nervous system and elsewhere. And so, yes, it's GABA that is the neurotransmitter that is affected by the depressants. What else? That's that. Oh yes, there's one other important depressant that was invented in the 1960s and 70s and still available today, and it's called Rohypnol. Rohypnol has been referred to as the date rape drug. because of its colorless, odorless character, and the fact that it's a liquid that can be easily slipped into drinks, not unlike the chloral hydrate of the Mickey Finn days. Sometimes going by the name Roofies or R2 or Rib. Rohypnol has been illegitimately used often enough that it is generally considered a fairly heavily controlled drug, but can still be taken by prescription in the U.S. today. So to summarize, we have sedatives and hypnotics, and for each of those uses, there are two categories that we've covered. One from the early 20th century, the barbiturates, and one later, the benzodiazepines, with a few in between there, methaqualone, and some others that don't quite fit into the same category. There is some concern about using sedatives as an anxiolytic or an anxiety drug, as while they do slow the nervous system, they can have an effect on clinical depression and have some other negative consequences as well. Anxiolytics do tend to be overprescribed today as well. It's common to get a prescription for other medical conditions that might lead someone to anxiety. For instance, I was diagnosed with a condition of the inner ear known as Meniere's disease, which can be accompanied by tinnitus or tinnitus, a ringing in the ears, which can really drive somebody crazy until they get used to it. Doesn't bother me now, but my ear, nose, throat doctor prescribed, or he asked me if I wanted a prescription for Xanax when giving that diagnosis, knowing that the ringing can really disturb some people to the point of becoming very anxious about it. I declined the invitation to prescribe to Xanax and start taking a drug because I'm generally not one who's going to treat symptoms like that with a drug. I'd much prefer to use talk therapy, yoga, all sorts of other methods which have been successful in reducing my attention to the symptoms of Meniere's disease. All right, what else we got here? Regarding using sedative hypnotics as a sleep aid, the hypnotic use, there are concerns about that as well. Long-term use of certain sleep aids can result in very profound negative cognitive effects. There's a group that are not benzodiazepines. They're simply called non-benzodiazepines. Lunesta, Ambien, Sonata. These are trade names for drugs that are typically used for insomnia today. And they do come with some risks of, we'll call it maybe mental degradation if taken long-term for insomnia. There are certainly other ways to treat insomnia that may be more behavioral than drug-based, and I encourage you to read through my list on the notes there of what you can do if you encounter insomnia and difficulty sleeping in your lives. These are the cabins here at Camp Fiver where the campers stay in the summertime. They're unoccupied now. That's why I can use the trail. There's a third use of sedative hypnotics, and that is for anticonvulsant purposes. Use of these drugs as anticonvulsants usually accompany other medicines, and they're taken in low doses simply to slow the nervous system and give it time to recover from the seizures that accompany seizure-related disorders. potential problems of using depressants as anticonvulsants include the tolerance that can develop, so higher and higher doses would be necessary, and any abrupt withdrawal from depressants when one has a seizure disorder can cause seizures. Obviously not a good thing. And the tolerance and withdrawal effects are a concern for all users of sedative hypnotics, because they can lead to higher tolerance, necessitating higher doses, and withdrawal can be accompanied by some pretty severe symptoms. Toxicity-wise, the sedative hypnotic classification of depressants can have the same behavioral effects as alcohol, leading to a impaired judgment, a kind of inability to follow along with the story, if you will. The physical aspects of these sedative hypnotics includes respiratory depression, which means a slowing of the breathing, and that can be particularly dangerous when the drugs are combined with alcohol. So one thing you want to be very careful of is the combination of alcohol and depressant drugs like benzodiazepines or barbiturates, because both are depressants and they can have an amplifying effect on each other, thereby reducing respiration to a minimum and sometimes even leading to death. Okay, let me get past this downhill here and we'll finish off this chapter with a discussion of inhalants. Here we go. Okay, inhalants. Inhalants are obviously depressants that you inhale. I think it's obvious. Vapors, fumes. You might have smelled a magic marker. You might have smelled gasoline or model glue, or lots of different substances give off toxic vapors that, when inhaled, act very much in the same way that depressants do on the body. Lighter fluid, correction fluid, those kinds of things. Volatile solvents, aerosols, propellants, gases, butane that is found in spray paints or hairspray, lighter butane. Whipped cream cans have nitrous oxide in them. They are an inhalant. Nitrites, such as isoamyl or isobutyl nitrites, sometimes called locker room or rush or poppers. These are inhalants that can have depressant-like effects. Another downhill. Woo. All right. Inhalants can be particularly dangerous because it is very difficult to control dosage. There are extremely toxic effects on the brain and the body, and certainly long-term use would reveal some fairly profound negative effects on the brain and body. Some of the dangers include kidney damage, brain damage, peripheral nerve damage, inflation of the respiratory tract, severe headache, death by suffocation. You can, in fact, die from doing inhale, just breathing glue fumes, if there's enough of it and it's intense enough. So, very low safety margin. There's an image of a person's brain who was a regular inhalant user, and it's very clear that the brain itself loses mass upon the regular use of some of these drugs. So I want to be very careful about the use of them. Ooh, up and over. Ooh, boing. There we go. All right, well, that pretty much wraps it up for the chapter. I tried to keep it a little shorter this time around. Hopefully that helps. And we'll get into a brief review of Chapter 9 of High Price. Home is where the hatred is. And so let's see what Carl Hart has to say about his transition back from England and Japan and the Air Force to the United States. See you then. One more downhill. Here we go. Down. This one's steep. And we made it.
Hart discusses in Chapter 9, Home is Where the Hatred Is, the origins of the title of the chapter. At the beginning of the chapter, he discusses his treatment being pulled over by police in England and how he didn't feel discriminated against in any particular ways in that incident. Whereas when he goes home to America and the U.S., he is pulled over and quite vividly feels the discrimination and the lack of respect. Even when he shows his military ID to the police to try to verify his identity, it's always just not good enough. So that's one origin of the title. Another way in which the title is meaningful is that it's the title of a Gil Scott-Heron song, the jazz artist of the 60s and 70s that he learned about from his friend Mark in the Air Force. So that's a song that you might want to go look up on YouTube. Check it out. It's a song about protest and activism. Later in the chapter, Hart talks about the 1980s being a moment when the true violence of the war on drugs is unleashed. This is the Ronald Reagan era, his presidency, in which there was a much greater attention to those policies of the war on drugs, particularly related to the crack so-called epidemic going on at that time. He says that the violence that he saw on the streets, while at the time he thought was in fact due to the rise of the crack phenomenon, he said is really a much deeper rooted phenomenon that is related probably more likely to the cultural and economic and even political institutions of the era. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, there was deindustrialization going on, while at the same time large numbers of whites were leaving inner cities and urban areas for the suburbs. So in the 60s and 70s, there was a loss of jobs, abandonment, I guess you could say, of communities, and that left many people in situations of poverty that hadn't been experienced since maybe the Great Depression, or certainly not in the 50s and 60s when times were good and manufacturing jobs were available in cities, and the Great Migration in the 1920s that brought large numbers of blacks to the northern cities was essentially paid for, if you will, by good manufacturing industrial jobs. Those jobs started disappearing in the 1960s as globalization really started to begin wholesale after World War II. And by the 70s and 80s, the hardships of the loss of jobs in urban regions were really starting to be experienced, and the violence was really a result, he says, more of those much deeper structural issues having to do with work and money and poverty, rather than the drugs. The drugs, he says, are just another symptom of deeper rooted sociological problems. So finally, by the end of that chapter, he discusses how the policy response, blaming drugs for many of these problems, and then putting more people in jail as a result of their possession, often just mere possession of drugs, was enough to condemn somebody to fairly lengthy prison terms. And he said that response was not the correct response. It was really more important that we addressed the social ills and structural dysfunctions of the economy, particularly in communities of color that had been disproportionately affected by those structural problems. So that's a little background on Chapter 9 there. Let's move on with assignments. The assignments this week are to do the online media on benzodiazepines. Take a look at the bi-weekly journal. It's going to be due at the end of next week, I believe, on chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11. Next week we have a double chapter assignment, so make sure you keep reading and read quickly through 10 and 11 in high price. For those of you working on the research project in SOCI 370, keep your mind on that. I'm going to get some feedback to you for your research outlines and citations, and you should continue on very quickly in beginning a rough draft of your paper that will be due relatively soon now. Well, of course, there's a quiz every week, and you should keep up with all those readings. All right. If I've forgotten something, check out the Brightspace page. I'm sure I'll mention it there. Thanks. Be well. See you next week.